Thanks for tuning in to the webinar on the integration of social emotional supports for students and teachers in your school. The webinar is sponsored by the New Orleans Trauma Informed Schools Learning Collaborative. Let's see if I can get the slides going here. We have an amazing team of professionals who've been immersed in this work for years, including folks you'll hear from today in part one of the webinar, which is what we're doing in this first segment. Teddy McGlynn Wright will participate in this webinar. He is the project director for the Trauma Informed Schools Training of Trainers program. And Dr. Denise Shervington is the CEO of the Institute for Women in Ethnic Studies. And I'm Stacey Overstreet. I'm on the faculty at Tulane University. Okay, so here's what we intend to cover through the webinar. To start, I want to just say we appreciate that you already have an understanding of the stress and trauma that your students face. But what we're hoping to do is really create a strong shared understanding of the most common experiences our students face here in New Orleans, and also really the role of systemic racism in shaping those experiences for Black and Brown students. We also want to expand our lens to increase our awareness around the stress and trauma faced by your teachers and probably yourselves in this specific moment in time. We want to highlight the implications of stress and trauma experiences for student learning and student behavior, and also for teacher instruction, really with an eye towards resilience and thinking about specific approaches to boost resilience at the tier 1 or universal level. So those are the concepts we're going to cover in part one of the webinar. Part two of the webinar will really sort of drill down on some specific approaches that schools can use to foster student and teacher resilience. And in that webinar, we really hope that to give you some concrete examples of supports that schools can use. And for schools who are already providing some of those supports, we hope that that conversation will really help sort of sharpen the intentionality of the strategies that you all are using in your schools already. Okay, but we will proceed now to part one. And our framework for the webinar is really grounded in the key features of trauma-informed schools to think about the social and emotional supports we're providing, although the webinar isn't specifically about trauma-informed schools. But regardless of the approach you take to social emotional learning, we really believe that it's critical to realize the prevalence and impact of trauma, to recognize the signs of trauma and the need for learning supports in your students, and to respond in ways that promote healing and avoid re-traumatization. And if you have this as your framework or the foundation of what you do, it will really guide you to approaches that support students exposed to trauma, but these same approaches are great for all students. So it's a great framework for thinking about the work. Okay, so I'm gonna turn it over to Teddy, and he's gonna tell us some key concepts and definitions that we'll be using today.
Awesome, thanks, Stacey. So one of the things that we have to start with always when we're having these kinds of conversations is, what are we talking about when we talk about trauma, especially now as trauma-informed schools get more popular and the idea of trauma gets more out there in kind of mainstream conversations, mainstream media. I was listening to a podcast recently when they were talking about how the advent of the traumedy, right? So we know that the kind of concept of trauma is out there, but because it's out there in the way that it is, we really want to be specific about what we're talking about when we talk about trauma and trauma-informed schools. So for us, this integrative definition of trauma really involves these kind of three pieces. So one is that it's the harmful interruption of safety, agency, dignity, or belonging. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. We'll break down what that means. Secondly, that it can be acute, chronic, cumulative, or complex, right? So it can be incidental, it can happen over time, it can be cumulative, which just means it can accumulate, right? So similar to over time, but kind of adding on to one another, being additive in that way. Or it can be complex, which means that there might be kind of related, interrelated, or unrelated traumas that folks are encountering. So folks might be in poverty and subjected to violence, and other things can be happening kind of in their home and in their communities, right? And lastly, that trauma overwhelms our ability to cope and integrate our experiences. So one of the most popular ways that folks think about trauma is through this idea of triggers. And what triggers mean, for me, I think about triggers as time travel, right? So in the moment that I'm experiencing a trigger, I'm actually transporting myself back to the moment of that initial trauma in my body. Like all of my kind of physiological responses are the same as they were in that moment. And that means that that moment was unintegrated. It kind of continues to exist outside of my normal memory and normal processes. So really thinking about like bad things can happen, even really terrible experiences can happen, and people can find ways of coping with them and dealing with them and integrating them in their lives. And when one of those things overwhelms someone's ability to cope and to kind of put that memory in its place, then they continue to kind of relive that trauma in their bodies and in their minds and in their behaviors over time. And that's when we talk about, that's what we're talking about when we talk about trauma and we talk about triggers. So like I said, here we go. So safety, agency, dignity, and belonging. The work that this definition comes from a lot of different places, but it's rooted in work out of the Bay Area and the generative somatics team. It's also out of work that I was doing when I was in Seattle before I moved here, which really focused on, I was working with a school that had seen about a half dozen murders and suicides in that school population over the course of a few months. And they did the normal things, which they called in all the social workers and they called in mental health folks and they said, well, how do we do this? And they also called in public health folks. And the conversation that we got to have was one in which we decided that the definitions that we were using around trauma and violence weren't actually applicable to the community that we were talking about. Right? These are folks who were in alternative school settings and so had already been subjected to other kinds of traumas and violence. And that the kind of rush in and do this kind of acute work wasn't really the thing that needed to happen. So we had to have a definition that was working for these young folks. And what we came to was that it's part of it was about safety. So physical and psychological, emotional safety, security, the ability to feel safe from harm, but also safe to explore and try new things. Agency, which is the definition that we use, comes from the Northwest Network for LGBT survivors of abuse. And really the idea is that, we can make a decision, experience reasonable consequences, and make another decision, right? And so at any place where that breaks down, that's a place where trauma can get in. So if I make a decision but experience unreasonable consequences, like if I run a red light and get stopped by the police and then shot, right? Like that's an unreasonable consequence. If I experience reasonable consequences for my actions and then can make different decisions, then I'm actually, I'm able to practice agency in that way. In the same way, if my agency, my ability to make decisions is really limited, then I'm also not being agentic in that. So dignity is the sense of kind of personal power, place, self-worth. One of the things that happens is that we often kind of hang our self-worth on these other things, and that can make it easy for our dignity to get compromised. And lastly is belonging. And I do save the best for last because I think that we don't always think about belonging as a kind of innate necessary need for people. And yet as social animals, it's crucial. And that if our belonging is interrupted, it's an existential threat. Like if we don't belong to the herd or the tribe or the pack, then we don't actually exist in a pretty significant way, right? So threats to belonging, so shame and embarrassment, tools that often get used to kind of corral folks and get them to come back and do what we want. And those things are actually threats to belonging. Those are potentially traumatic events for folks. And lastly, I just want to say that often we're in a position, you're great, often we're in a position where we have to trade one for the other, right? Like I can hold on to my safety, but I have to sacrifice my dignity, right? I can hold on to agency, but then I might lose belonging, right? And those kinds of trade-offs, again, put us in a position where we are likely to experience traumatic events and experience the kind of trauma of everyday life, frankly. All right. Again, often when folks are talking about trauma, they talk about it in this either individual or interpersonal way, right? So we might talk about the trauma of, witnessing harm or abuse in the family or, sexual assault or any of these things that kind of show up in our individual and interpersonal lives. And what we need to remember is that those are all happening within a collective and systemic context. So part of what that means is that, yes, I can have an individual trauma and I have that experience. And also I can be impacted by collective trauma, right? So that everyone in my kin group or everyone in my community is suffering that same trauma, like that also has an impact, again, on my physiological response to harm. It might be overwhelming for my system. It might be overwhelming for the collective system, right? And then systemic, right? So what policies and institutions that may be perpetuating trauma and perpetuating violence on folks. Lastly, that it can be historical and intergenerational. Historical meaning that it happened at one point in time and it reverberates over time, right? So we can think about often we think about kind of genocides, the Holocaust, mass deportation, mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is kind of ongoing, but the other ones kind of happen at a fixed point in time and then reverberate through time, right? So historical traumas that still show up for folks particularly in community and kin groups over time. And intergenerational is about like how we pass that trauma on. And that might be like me passing on unhealed trauma, right? Like traumatic experiences that I had that I then pass on to my children because I have not processed that or been able to kind of move through those traumatic experiences. It also happens through silence, right? So if we don't talk about, if we don't name the traumas that have happened, again, often in collective or kinship groups, not just individually, then that silence can even have an impact on later generations, and because it essentially raises up some sort of fear of this like terrible thing that could have happened or did happen, but that we don't really know about or we don't really speak about. And it's driving all of these behaviors, but we don't really understand why, right? And so intergenerational trauma can show up that way. And so because trauma operates at all those levels, resilience also has to happen at all those levels. Healing has to happen at all those levels. We have to think about like, what are the systemic ways in which we can be moving folks toward resilience? What kind of policies and can we put in? What kinds of institutional supports can we put in to make sure that folks are relatively well or that we're building their resilience? When we do this work around trauma-informed schools, that's part of what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to say, so as a system, how do we make sure that folks have agency, safety, dignity, and belonging? Like, what are the policy level things that we're doing to make that happen? In collective and kinship groups, healing and resilience can show up in lots of different ways. The way that people kind of come together, belonging obviously is the one that always pops for me in terms of collective and kinship groups, but dignity, like how do we hold collective dignity together, right? So when folks are mourning, when folks are marching in the streets, when folks are standing up together, like those are ways of expressing collective dignity. And then individually, all these different ways that our individual kind of safety and agency can show up. And then again, historical and intergenerational, right? So how do we create moments that are pivot points or that are inversion moments so that historical things that have happened that have been traumatic for folks don't perpetuate into the future? How do we make sure that those are inflections and say like, oh, actually, that's not going to happen ever again, right? And we do this through memorial, we do this through song, we do this through dance, we do this through art. But there are lots of ways to say like, oh, yes, this thing absolutely happened and it will never happen again. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Teddy. Now that we've got some key concepts down, we're going to talk a little bit about the prevalence of traumatic experiences, stressful and traumatic experiences. So the New Orleans Trauma-Informed Schools Learning Collaborative has produced a report based on survey responses of about 450 New Orleans public school teachers. And so I want to start here with some of their experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic. So exposure to COVID-19, as you can see from this list of different types of experiences that folks might have, includes some potentially traumatic events as well as some events that are that represent stressors. It's a great example of collective trauma because we are all experiencing COVID-19. And in fact, all teachers reported experiencing stressors related to the pandemic. And on average, in fact, teachers reported experiencing 7 different kinds of stressors in the midst of the pandemic. The most common experiences for teachers are really universal to all of us, including the stress of being separated from family and friends, or the stress of needing to transition our work to a home environment. But there are also some unique experiences that teachers report, including things like becoming really acutely aware of the stressors that their students are facing at home. And also teachers have reported emotional distress as a result of COVID-19. So I think it's important just to realize that the collective nature of these experiences means that really your entire workforce and likely yourselves are coming back under the weight of these experiences to a job already inherently stressful. I also want to note that for our Black teachers, COVID-19 experiencers are not just collective, they are also tied up in systemic racism that really drives disparities in access to economic resources and access to healthcare. And you can see that here in the health disparities that showed up in the responses to our surveys. So Black teachers were much more likely to be personally impacted by COVID-19. So they were 4.3 times more likely than white teachers to become ill with COVID-19, and 4.6 times more likely to experience the death or the death of a family member or friend due to COVID-19. So I think that we've seen this in at the national level, these sorts of disparities, and just to sort of bring it home, in New Orleans, 75% of the deaths related to COVID-19 have happened in the Black community. So I wanted to just point out this idea of both collective individual experiences with stress and trauma, collective experiences that are happening within a community, and how issues of systemic racism can drive those experiences. Patty is going to tell us some about the experiences of our students.
Awesome. Thanks, Stacey. So, the top line thing here really is that, this is all pre-COVID. So before COVID, folks had done this kind of research and looked at like, what are young folks in our city experiencing? And we found is that, over 90% of them experienced some level of community violence. More than half had experienced 3 or more traumas, right? So if that's what we're looking at in terms of our population, when we talk about trauma-informed schools, we're talking about, this kind of tier 1 level stuff, because most of the folks walking in, most of the young people walking into your doors have had some experience with trauma, much of it being either community violence exposure or the loss of a loved one. And again, we know that those are things that are happening kind of within a context. So since COVID-19 really hit, what we've seen is that the unemployment rate has spiked, and we know what comes with unemployment. We see spikes in food insecurity and homelessness. We see spikes in domestic violence and child maltreatment. We see, as Stacey was saying, that 75% of COVID-19 related deaths have been in the Black community. I was reading in the paper recently that it's higher if you take folks out, if you take out folks who are living in nursing homes, right? So what we're looking at is something that is really specifically hitting Black communities, and how folks make sense of that, how people make meaning of that is going to be really important for folks as you're thinking about opening schools again. So just to bring it back to this reminder, right, that trauma can operate at all these levels. And I think what I want us to really take away from this is that the individual stories and individual traumas that folks are walking in with are happening within this larger context. I had a conversation recently with a parent of a 7-year-old who, the way that they were making meaning of the COVID-19 epidemic was they said that that's the disease that kills grandmas, right? And so for that little Black kid, right, like that is the way that that kid understands that, this pandemic. And from the mouths of babes, right, like really clear, really incisive. And imagine the worry that that kid walks into school with if we're thinking about, well, is that kid thinking like, oh, I'm going to take this home and it's going to hurt my grandmother, right? Like really for us to be able to think about when things are happening at the pandemic level, when they're happening in this collective and kinship community, we have to really be thinking about young folks walking into the building, like how are we helping them make meaning of this thing that is coming at them, and that they're not winding up walking away with a sense of, oh, this is a thing that only affects Black people, or that there's something wrong with Black people and that's why it's happening to us, right? That they walk away with a sense of like, this thing is happening to Black people in the context of systemic racism, in the context of health insurance and healthcare that is really racist, in the context of, poverty rates that are really disproportionate, right? Like really allowing them to see like, oh yeah, like this pandemic like hits everybody, but it hurts us more because we have less protection, right? That we're less insulated from the negative effects of it. So as we think about these traumas, as we think about kind of exposure to community violence, as we think about the experiences of young folks who in this kind of COVID era, like really wanting us to be able to hold this idea that trauma can operate at all these levels. And we're not just emphasizing, oh yeah, like these are individual things or individual stories, but we're really looking at what's happening systemically outside of our school building and what's happening systemically inside of our school building. Thanks. So when we're talking about systemic trauma, we're talking about this era of dual pandemics, right? So we had a pandemic that was viral, and now we have a pandemic that is really interpersonal, but obviously very systemic. And what we see is that, with police killings, that it's very rare that those folks are held to account, and that we know that we're much more likely to be killed by police. And I make sure that this is not an interpersonal issue. This isn't about like individual bad white police officers killing individual Black people, that it happens in a context in which most of those folks are not held to account. So it's not individuals are doing this, it is a systemic attack on Black people. So it's a systemic attack on a collective that happens, right, that we see kind of in an individual way. But I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that it's happening in this larger context. Next slide. All right, and so with that, what we know is that there's a different exposure and there's a different response to that exposure, right? So when Black folks are exposed to that killing, we have worse mental health days. And so when you're thinking about not just the young folks who are coming into your building who have been exposed to these killings, but the grown folks who are coming into your building who've been exposed to this violence are having worse mental health days as well. And again, could have some individual responses to that, right? We could do the EAP thing. There's other ways that folks can kind of get what they need. But don't lose sight of the fact that that's happening to this collective being, to this collective body. Excuse me. And so the poor mental health that folks are experiencing isn't about like, oh, this individual thing happened to me. The poor mental health that folks are experiencing is there's an attack on folks who look like me. And what is my school building, what is my school community doing that allows me to feel more safe, more secure, a sense of agency, dignity? What is my school building doing? What is my school community doing to make me feel a sense of belonging? Because I'm in a situation in which my mental health is going to be subjected to this systemic violence that folks are experiencing, this collective trauma. Next slide. And this piece around collective and systemic trauma and the criminalization of young folks, we can look at these disparities and folks, this is well documented, right? So we know that these disparities are happening. We know that folks are being put out of school. We also know that folks are being put out of classrooms at disproportionate rates. And I think that the piece that we really want to hold here is that when we look at what's happening within your school building, how are you as a collective, how are you as a system, as an institution, disproportionately disciplining or criminalizing Black students, right? And in some ways, like setting them up to become more criminalized as they get older, right? So what I want us to be able to look at here is say, all right, so here are some tier 1 strategies that we're doing to make everyone feel a sense of safety. We really want to push that. We want folks to feel agency. And then also systemically, we want to say, like, let's really look at our discipline plan and discipline policies, attendance policies to see, like, are they disproportionately harming Black students? And if so, like, what is the move for us to do there? Like, how do we actually generate kind of increased resilience rather than increased harm when young folks are coming in having high trauma exposure? Okay, last one. So, all of this, when we're kind of in this mode of saying, so what is happening inside of our school buildings? We really have to say, where does overrepresentation and underrepresentation happen? And what is, for school leaders and for other folks in the school building, like, what's your piece of that, right? Like, how are you operating within the machinery that criminalizes Black students? And what's your role in that machinery? How do you disrupt the things that are happening so that we can really shift what's happening here? And I think for all of these, whether it's out referrals to law enforcement, whether it's school-related arrests, we think about all the movements that are happening right now to get police out of schools. Part of that move is to say, there are things that are happening inside the school building, there are resources that kids need, and while referral to law enforcement may be one way to get those folks resources, we also know that the later on impact of that is really disproportionate and really harsh, right? So for young folks who wind up with arrest records by the time they're in 8th grade, they're much more likely to wind up being incarcerated by the time they're 21. So, this thing that we're doing, like, help this kid when they're 12 or 13 or 11, like, yes, we want to get them resources, we want to get them help, and schools and jails are the only places that are guaranteed, right? what we don't want to do is set that kid up to then be, later incarcerated. And we know that, again, schools and prisons are the places that are catching so many of the failures of our social safety net, but we don't actually have to actively participate in that, right? So what are the ways that we can kind of break that down and break away from it? And this is an opportunity for you to take a pause. That was a lot of data, a lot of information, and really want folks to sit with what are you thinking and feeling as you heard that? Are there things that stuck out to you? Are there particular slides that you were like, what? Wow, or like, no way, right? To really have a sense of what are you thinking and feeling during this moment? And then for you all to be in your reflection about, what trauma patterns are you noticing within your community, within your school community on a year-to-year basis, and to just kind of spend some time there. Thanks.
Thanks, Teddy. So we hope that you'll take the time to stop and think about that. The next piece we want to move to is really now understanding the impact of these experiences at the neurobiological level. And Dr. Shervington is going to walk us through some of those. Oops, sorry, Dr. Shervington. Okay, there you go.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Overstreet. I am tasked with really having to share some of the science about why is it important that we think about trauma and how it impacts the individual. We now have ample science, which I will share briefly about how trauma impacts the brain, the neurobiologic system. And we also know that many later life illnesses, mental and physical illnesses, can have the root cause being exposure to traumas during early life. So it's really important for us to just be aware of how what happens on the outside, external events, can really get inside and impact the brain, the biology, the full biology, and ultimately illnesses that we get at older ages in our life. So next slide. So what happens, and thanks Teddy for talking about some of the sources of trauma in young people's life. So with chronic exposure, and in particular, if that exposure is toxic, meaning that their young person does not have access to being able to manage or deal with or be soothed, and therefore build resilience to the chronic traumas that they're exposed to, we know that the limbic system in the brain really sends out the signal that there is danger. And this is a survival mechanism. It's evolutionary, we're in the jungle and there are lions attacking, and the body needed to have a response because survival was threatened. And really, another way that I look at trauma is any experience when it overwhelms the body. It's almost like an experience, like a death experience, a threat to one's survival, and this neurobiologic system gets activated. So what happens is, in the limbic area, the three little areas of the brain I think it's important for us all to know about: the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. The sensations, the thalamus in the brain sends signals that there's danger. And these other areas, the amygdala senses fear, it becomes hyperactive. The hippocampus, which is regulating our memory and our emotions, it becomes dysregulated. Either it selectively cuts the memory, or it overplays the memory of what happened. And then the prefrontal cortex, which is that area of the brain that helps us to think, to plan, to reason, it gets shut down. Because when trauma is happening, the body is trying to figure out what should it do. Should it fight back? Should it run? Should it go into flight? And for some folks, should it go into the freeze mode? And so it's really, really important to recognize that this chronic exposure ultimately dysregulates these areas of the brain. So the amygdala, hyperactive, so the person becomes hyper-aroused, is always on the lookout for something wrong happening. Could almost, that person in their hypervigilance could almost seem as if they're paranoid because they don't trust and they're just looking for the next bad thing to happen. The hippocampus, which is supposed to help to regulate our memory, either there are aspects of our experiences that it's trying to damp down so that we don't remember, or there are pieces of it that it cannot keep from our consciousness and we keep reliving. Bad dreams, flashbacks, all of that is being regulated in the hippocampus. And as I had mentioned, the prefrontal cortex, that really is that area of the brain that we depend on, that supposedly makes us different as human beings, where we're analytic and we think and we plan. It gets shut down because the energy is about survival. Next slide. Okay. So thinking about the chronic activation of the limbic area, the hypothalamic pituitary axis, it's called, we need to remember that because it's always on the lookout for trouble. The amygdala is constantly sensing the environment to see, is there trouble, so that you can be prepared. You don't want what happened before to happen again. We need to remember that being in that state, and I think Teddy, you'd mentioned earlier this idea of triggers, the brain is keeping a memory of some of the things that happened in the past, so that you can say, hey, it looks like we're getting back in this situation, so get ready. And just so this is what we call triggers. Sometimes we talk about cues. The body is really queued up, ready to go. And any little memory that is a reminder of what happened in the past. It's almost as if thinking that when there is chronic trauma, or sometimes an acute trauma, where the brain is kind of frozen in that past experience. And much of what we're not really in the present. We are always slightly in the past, ready to take action to survive and trying to move on to the future. So some of these triggers for young people can be yelling or fighting, especially if they're in communities or in households where there's violence. So anything in the classroom that can trigger, that cues them up, because, hey, this is the last time that something bad happened. There were these signals, fighting, yelling. For some folks, touch, and some of the traumas usually associated with that, kids who have experienced either physical abuse or sexual abuse, they might be really sensitive to touch, and it might happen in the classroom that someone touches a kid and they really become dysregulated, and we can't understand. There's nothing seemingly in the present, but it could be a trigger of some past terrible traumatic experience, loud noises, if there's fighting, if there's yelling, if there's screaming. And one of the ways for kids who are chronically exposed to trauma, one of the ways they survive is by being able to predict what's going to happen. So for some kids, if there are unexpected changes to their routines, they just become really dysregulated, because part of their survival is to be able to predict when something goes like 1 + 1 = 2. Not the fear that 1 + 1 could equal 3. So they like to have their same routines. For some kids, if there's shaming, especially if they're failing, it can be a trigger to perhaps earlier experiences that were traumatic, in which part of the defense mechanisms were around shame and fear. And finally, for some kids, anniversaries, as we all know, and it follows us into adulthood, that sometimes when bad things happen at certain points in time, again, the idea that the past becomes so important when we are traumatized, that the brain somehow will remember that either a month ago this bad thing happened, or 6 months ago, or 12 months ago. So sometimes it's really, really important when there's a young person in the classroom and you can't understand what's happening. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of anything in the present that might make them seemingly somewhat dysregulated in terms of their feelings or their behaviors. Sometimes a simple conversation where you might try to help the person understand, if nothing isn't happening in the present, did something happen recently or some time ago that perhaps you're remembering and that's bothering you? That can go a really long way to help someone deal with trauma.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Shervington. I know that you might have to tap out of the webinar, so that is fine if you need to go. What we're going to talk about next is actually some of what Dr. Shervington has already mentioned, that when our survival brains are activated, either in the moment of a trauma or as we're looking around for threat to be sure we can ensure our safety, that can result in some pretty specific behaviors in the classroom that, again, really sort of connect to the trauma responses of fight, flight, or freeze. Dr. Shervington mentioned some of these, but if your amygdala brain is activated, you're in survival brain, you are not going to be at your best in terms of regulating your emotions. So you may become easily frustrated or set off. There could be unpredictable emotional reactions, perhaps because of trauma triggers that are kicking those off. Also could be impulsive aggression and a real difficulty calming themselves. So the prefrontal cortex is offline, and it's usually the part of our brain that is helping us reason through things and settle down and calm ourselves. And so without that area of the brain being fully engaged, again, the amygdala sort of rules the day. We can also see this in flight. A lot of our teachers that we work with tell us stories about kids who really just wander out of the classroom or walk the halls when they get agitated. So this real behaviors that allow them to remove themselves from the situation are also common. It can also look like social withdrawal or a disengagement from folks. You might see students with their heads down on their desk or really kind of physically withdrawing from the situation as indicators of a flight response. And then also the freeze response, we can see, I think we're less used to looking for that, right, in terms of behaviors in our classroom. But for students who might seem like they're just not paying attention or daydreaming, that may be their way of modulating the internal arousal that they're having in the moment. And so an attempt to really to remove themselves from that moment at a cognitive level is another way of dealing with the arousal that students can have when they're in survival brain. We can also see this in teachers, right? So we talk a lot about kids, and that's our focus. We want to know how traumatic experiences are impacting our students. But for teachers who are coming back and dealing with a lot of stress and trauma, they may also be a little irritable in their classrooms, right? And have some unpredictable emotional reactions. Or they may socially withdraw from their students as they are coping with the arousal that they're experiencing. Or they may have, moments of sort of zoning out or daydreaming. So these same behaviors are really universal in terms of how folks deal with the stressors that they're carrying around. Okay, so the other thing I want to talk about, though, is that there are also real implications for this for learning and memory. So when the amygdala and emotions are ruling the day through our survival brain, it's really hard for students to think clearly. So chronic trauma, again, sort of turns down our thinking brains. It takes our prefrontal cortex and our hippocampus offline. And in fact, there's some data to indicate that the stress hormone cortisol, which is released a lot and in high levels for kids exposed to chronic trauma can actually do some damage to those parts of the brain to really, that results in them being taken offline. When that happens, things like learning become harder. So learning new information is more effortful. You may need more trials to get new information into your long-term memory because the hippocampus isn't functioning the way it should. Students can have difficulty paying attention, problem solving, sort of taking the perspective of others, again, really engaging that rational brain. And both of these things can really impact performance and engagement. Because the work is so difficult, students may lose the motivation. And so you may see some performance issues or engagement issues. Again, just want to point out that we can see these same kinds of things in teachers who are dealing with the chronic stress and trauma. So teachers might be struggling, like organizing their lesson plans or taking the perspective of their students. So they may not have the capacity in a moment to sort of step back and consider another's perspective. They may have difficulty mastering new learning, like the online learning that was demanded of them as we broke for the pandemic. So all of those things, again, impact anyone who's facing experiences of chronic trauma. So it's not surprising then if students are walking into your classroom every day in survival brain with the thinking brain sort of taken offline, that over time that's going to lead to some real academic problems. And so this is a study out of Washington State who they measured the experiences of ACEs, which is another way to think about stress and trauma exposure in kids. And as the experiences of ACEs increased, so did the percentage of students who were struggling academically. And so you can really see that once students have experienced 3 or more of those traumatic experiences, learning difficulties become pretty common. So about 80% of students in that sample who experienced 3 or more ACEs had academic concerns or problems. Okay, so again, we're sort of at the end of a section where that's a lot. There are a lot of bad things that can happen with chronic stress and trauma exposure, but I also want to really strongly highlight the fact that those bad things are not inevitable. And we know that we don't have to experience those bad outcomes, or even if we have a moment in time where we do experience those outcomes, we can recover from them, right? And so the 2 things that that the science shows are really important and that we use in our work a lot is to focus on the supportive relationships that students and teachers have in their environment, and also their skills at regulating those really intense emotions. Excuse me. Supportive relationships are very powerful because they can both help modulate the arousal in the moment that a stressor is experienced. So if you are with someone that you trust and you feel like sort of has your back as something is happening and you're becoming aroused, that relationship, being in the presence of that relationship, can actually help sort of lessen the response, the physiological response that you'll have to that. But also through those supportive relationships, we learn ways of healing and recovering from those experiences. And we learn that in those relationships, we are safe. And so we can turn down the survival brain and let our thinking brain come online. So supportive relationships are really key, as is emotional regulation. Because we know that when kids are in survival brain, emotional regulation is going to be difficult. When they're aroused, that's not really the time to expect or teach regulation skills, right? And I know that we often have that tendency to want to, in the moment of a crisis, ask kids, like, what's going on in your mind? Why are you doing this? And really get them to think about their behavior and try to regulate it. But that's not the best time to build the skills. And so we really focus a lot on finding opportunities across the school day to help students build their emotional regulation skills so that when they become aroused, they have a toolkit they can reach into to help them really contain that arousal and recover from that arousal. So in part 2 of the webinar, we're really going to be delving into some of the approaches that we can use in schools to respond to students in ways that will promote healing, foster regulation, and also avoid re-traumatization. So I'm looking forward to joining you for that part 2 of the webinar. Welcome to part 2 of the webinar. We're going to continue to hear some insights from our amazing team members. In this segment, we'll hear from Liz Marcel-Williams, who is the CEO for the Center for Resilience, and Kathleen Whalen, who is the Project Director for Safe Schools NOLA. Just a quick recap. In part 1 of the webinar, we reviewed the prevalence and impact of trauma through the lens of systemic racism. We focused on recognizing certain behaviors and learning patterns as possible signs of the neurobiological impact of chronic trauma exposure. And we talked about the concept of resilience and acknowledged the power of relationships and regulation to promote healing in students. In this part of the webinar, we will sort of dig into that 4th learning objective, and we'll focus in on social emotional supports for teachers and students as a way to respond to their needs and avoid re-traumatization. We're going to have this discussion sort of focused in 3 domains: supports and strategies that you could use to acknowledge the stress and trauma experienced by teachers and students, and then supports and strategies to think about supporting student and teacher regulation and relationships. Now, in the first part of the webinar, we pretty clearly laid out the rationale for the work in these 3 areas. But as we enter each area, we'll just also share a little bit of data from 2 surveys to reinforce the importance of this work. The first survey that we'll draw from is the teacher survey that I talked about in part 1 of the webinar with about 450 New Orleans public school teachers. And then the second survey that we would draw some data from was recently put out by the Educational Research Alliance based on student perceptions of schools pre-pandemic. Okay, so we will get started with the first domain, and just as a way of emphasizing the importance of acknowledging stress and trauma of our students and teachers, in the NOLA teacher survey that we did, just about 20% of teachers indicated the need for time and space to collectively process the experiences that we've all had during this pandemic. But we know from the student survey that 44% of our Black students don't feel emotionally safe at school. So the question really is how to navigate these supports given that data. I did forget to say, so I want to just briefly say here before we get to strategies, that the reason that we're pulling out Black student perceptions as we highlight this data for you is because, as you know, the majority of our student body represents Black students, but also because in these 3 areas that we're talking about today, there were significant discrepancies between the perceptions of Black and white students. So we really just want to center the students of the voices of our Black students. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Liz and Kathleen, and they're going to tell you about some of the ways to provide supports in this domain.
Thanks, Stacy. So I'll kick us off by talking about teacher supports, and I won't necessarily hit every bullet point when we're reviewing the slides, but I do want to talk a little bit about being able to clearly communicate to teachers and other school-based staff what the plans are to respond to the impact of COVID-19 on staff and families. And I think this is only becoming more important as what the return to school looks like is becoming less and less certain in time. So certainly, like the different phases that we worked on in my organization were naming this, getting input, and then providing helpful information to staff. So we did do a staff survey where we asked questions on everything from what their caregiver status was, if they live with folks who are immunocompromised, to what their daycare plans were, if they'd be able to return to work, and then just ask general levels of comfort and what things we could do to make the transition back to the school setting more comfortable for them. We also found that doing a webinar rather than just communicating via email was enormously helpful. It's reassuring for our staff to see faces and to be able to ask questions. And one of the things we're thinking about implementing moving forward are office hours so that there are opportunities to ask one-off questions or things that are on people's minds. And certainly from an HR perspective, being able to clearly communicate what wellness plans will look like, what different leave plans will be in effect given federal guidelines, et cetera. and also what the plans are to support staff emotional wellness. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later when we talk about supports for regulation, but certainly that's important. And then the second bullet point, just about the importance of providing foundational training in trauma. Again, now more than ever, recognizing that our kids have had to bear a disproportionate impact, most likely, of the coronavirus, and being sensitive to what that has meant for their experiences at home and their anxiety levels. And I'm sure Dr. Shervington, would echo what I'm saying when we talk about the importance of making sure that staff can realize what traumatic events are and the impact they can have, that they recognize the signs of trauma in children, that they know how to respond when they're seeing those, and implement trauma-informed practices at the individual and school level. And then also think actively about how you resist re-traumatization. So if you have children, for example, who've experienced abuse, that you're thoughtful about what physical interactions might look like, and that those 4 R's are at the foundation of any trauma training. So Kathleen, I'll turn it over to you to talk about student supports.
Thank you. I think it's really important that we talk a lot in Safe Schools Know about parallel process. So we're starting with teacher supports and then moving them to student supports. And I think particularly in the area of acknowledging the stress and trauma, we sometimes forget how even the littlest kids are really impacted by the stress and trauma of the adults around them, and also by their lack of understanding. So I'm starting with the second bullet with talking to students about COVID-19. I think it's essential that as teachers get information and understand what the precautions and what the protocols are going to be in schools and why they're like that, it's equally important to talk to students about those. You need to make sure, obviously, that they're developmentally appropriate, but even the littlest students need to have some understanding of why the teachers are wearing masks and why they can't eat in the cafeteria, and those things that will most likely be in place. So I do think it's really important to focus on remembering that even the littlest students are aware of what's going on around them. And certainly when you get to older students, middle school and high school age students, they're really able to process a lot of this stuff, and you can use that as a jumping off point for lesson planning and for conversations about both science and history and all of those things. You can use the information around COVID-19 as a jumping off point because it's there. We can't make believe it's not happening and just go on with the curriculum as it always was. The last one I do want to take 1 second to hit on the concept of safe and respectful places for discussion and reflection, because whether we come back or whether you're teaching your class remotely or you're in a classroom, spaces are going to be challenging. And I do think working with your class and setting up norms and setting up expectations and helping them understand that if you're in this classroom and you're a 4th grader, you will probably be with the same group of students all day long, and so that you can find a space that everyone agrees is sort of a safe space for children and to go and reflect and discuss. So I just think we need to remember that even though space will be a challenge, and it will be a challenge to set up those spaces or figure out how to do that remotely, it's still essential that that happens.
Great, thanks. And I'll also just say that, Kathleen, you highlighted certainly drawing on the COVID-19 information, integrating that into topics like science and social studies, given the focus we spent in part 1 of the webinar on systemic racism, social justice, equity. I think those topics can also easily be integrated into things like language arts and social studies. And so I think thinking about both of the pandemics that we're going through right now and how we can really bring those into our learning spaces.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so the other domain that we want to talk about is regulation. And in our teacher survey, 71% of teachers reported experiencing emotional distress as a result of the pandemic. And we know that when teachers are experiencing emotional distress, it is difficult for them to be a good source of emotional support for their students. And so they may have more difficulty effectively managing their classrooms when they're under significant distress. And in fact, in the teacher survey, in the student survey that was done, 65% of Black students felt that teachers could use some more support in effectively managing classrooms. And interestingly, 49% of students felt like they could use some extra support in being able to regulate their own emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. So it seems like the need has been identified all around, and I'll turn it back over to Liz and Kathleen.
Sure. So on the teacher support side of things, I want to highlight the importance of promoting staff self-care practices inside and outside the work environment, and also as an organization that employs teachers and other childcare professionals, knowing what the limits of your own abilities are and knowing when and how to refer staff out to those outside resources. I know at the Center for Resilience, we are revisiting our staff wellness plan and being very clear about the supports that we provide in-house, and when and how we support teachers who may need assistance beyond what we can do, so that we're just all very clear on that. But from a self-care standpoint, there are things that any school site could do, including working with staff members to develop self-care plans. There are a ton of resources online and templates that you could use, or having one of your mental health professionals walk your staff through the process of creating their own self-care plan and strategies. Kathleen talked earlier about the importance of parallel process, and much as we want to provide opportunities for kids to have groups and to process things together, wanting to provide that opportunity and space for teachers as well. Stacey, I was struck on this slide with the data previously about acknowledging stress and trauma, that it was only about 20% of teachers who said that they would like a process group where they can do this work together. We found something similar, but then we did have a whole lot of staff say, I'd also really like to be able to check in with someone just one-on-one, not so much in a group setting. So thinking about how you might leverage mental health providers in-house or contractually to provide that level of support to your staff. One of the things that we try and put in place is a self-care day that's on the calendar for the entire school year, once a month. Every fourth Wednesday, staff know the afternoon is free for them to do whatever it is, if it's watch reality TV or get a pedicure or go to yoga, or whatever the thing is that helps you get through your day and your week, that they can schedule that. And we also talk about knowing our triggers. So being really explicit about the fact that we are all human, and right now we're all working under a higher than usual amount of stress, and to be able to talk really safely with each other about, these are the things that can really upset me working with colleagues, or more importantly, when I'm working with children, and how we can support one another when you're having a tough moment, by having that level of awareness and politely suggesting that someone takes a phone call in the front office in a stressful moment or something along those lines. And I'd be remiss not to just mention quickly on the point of culturally responsive de-escalation and communication strategies. One of the things we talk a lot about at my job is the woeful lack of truly evidence-based therapeutic and supportive interventions, particularly for children of color, particularly of children who've experienced trauma. A lot of that research comes from communities that look very different than ours do, frankly, and there's not a lot out there. So we are continuing to try and flesh this out, but I would offer the Center for Resilience up as a resource, just in terms of our staff having an extensive amount of training with the one intervention that we've really liked, preventing long-term anger and aggression in youth, which is out of the University of Pennsylvania with Dr. Howard Stevenson. And that addresses racial trauma directly. It allows for conflict in a sports-based setting, and there's a clear protocol for what that looks like. And we've found that to be one culturally relevant intervention and de-escalation and conflict resolution strategy that we've used. Kathleen.
Thank you. I am going to combine bullet number 1 and the first bullet and the third bullet, because I think they actually speak to one of the most important things you can do with a group, whether you're in the classroom or whether you're working remotely, to establish that sort of sense of calm and that gives people the space to regulate themselves. And that is establish consistent routines and clear communication that, so when the children come into the school, or the young adults come into the school and come into your classroom or log on to your curriculum or whatever they're doing, they have a good sense of what to expect. So then they are free to engage in the next thing they need to engage in. And I think the reason, I think one of the ways to ensure that we do include movement and mindfulness breaks throughout the day is actually put that in your routines and rituals that you create with your class. So in the very beginning, you create those routines and rituals. It's going to be a new situation for everyone. It's going to be a lot of adjustments and new ways of doing things. And I think working from day one with the students in your class to sort of come up with your routines, come up with your regulations, come up with your expectations in ways that include movement and mindfulness so that they're not stuck on as an afterthought or get forgotten. I think it's really important to have those built into your day. And the other one is the idea of bite-sized segments for learning. I know there are a lot of teachers, I've spoken to a lot of teachers who are worried about academic learning loss. And I think we need to be really consistent in our presentation of our material so that we're not overwhelming students because we want to make sure they catch up and we want to make sure they learn what they need to learn. And because everyone is going to be learning so many things about how to prevent illness, they're going to be learning so many things about how to maneuver this new schedule, how to maneuver the buses, how to do all of those things. It's going to be important to have your academic blocks in sizes that students can comprehend, so there's not another thing to frustrate them or make them feel inadequate.
Great, thanks, Kathleen. Okay, and then the last domain that we'll touch on is supports for relationships. And pretty overwhelmingly, teachers in our survey indicated how important support from their colleagues and administrators were during this pandemic period in helping them deal with stress. Some schools hosted small Zoom coffee breaks where people could come together and just get support from folks. And that was really important and noteworthy for our teachers. On the student perception end of things, though, students are feeling like about half of Black students feel their teachers aren't concerned for their well-being, and 42% of Black students feel teachers don't value their ideas. So finding ways to sort of bridge what we know teachers want and love the relationships with their students, but really finding ways to communicate that and express that interest and value over student perceptions is important. And so I'll turn it over to Liz and Kathleen to talk about some strategies for that.
Great. So I think about the teacher supports in two ways. One is just what are the supports that are being provided to all the adults in a building around their own well-being, et cetera. And then what are the supports that are being provided to the adults around their interactions with children. And so certainly I think about the importance of creating peer-to-peer community building opportunities or rituals. Stacey talked a bit about the coffee chats that exist, community circles that can begin and end a week or a day, the process groups that we've referenced before. I think also celebrating small successes can't be underestimated. The importance of just coming together at the end of the day. We share out at the Center for Resilience where often we have some pretty challenging days or relationships where we go through the exercise of what went well today and making sure that that is recognized and celebrated. I think also, your data noted the importance of relationships with supervisors and administrators and creating space when you're checking in with your staff just to make sure, there is a moment to acknowledge this is a tough time. How are you doing? How are your loved ones? What are you bringing to the table today? And doing some of that vulnerable work yourself as a manager is really important. I know I shared with my team today, I've been working remotely. I have a toddler. It's been really stressful. He put a bubble wand in my coffee this morning. And when I was processing with him that mommy works really hard and why I cried. And I was like, oh, well, this is where I'm at. And that was part of my check-ins with my staff, just hey, it is okay to not be functioning at full capacity and be having a rough time. So I think that human connection around reflection, goal setting. I also think there's another important piece around just making sure you take the time to really define what you as an organization mean by healthy relationships. So what are the things that when you ask teachers to have good relationships with one another and with kids. What do you mean by that? So that when you are doing the work around reflecting and goal setting, you have a common language there. And I think about, what opportunities exist beyond providing direct instruction, whether it's in an elective or in a traditional content area. We talk a lot about the importance of the ability to play with our younger children and have, group activities, playing cards, whatever it might be, with older kids, so that there are some ways that this reinforcement of healthy relationships can happen. Kathleen, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, I'm going to start with the facilitate community building activities, and I'm going to refer back actually to some of what Stacy was talking about a minute ago. There's both a lot of contention and strife in the community as a whole around both COVID-19 and around questions of and awareness of structural and institutional racism. And I think that whether you're talking with 5-year-olds or 15-year-olds, it's going to be really important to work to build an understanding of your classroom, your group of students, and you as a community who are going to be able to work together to accomplish what it is you set out to accomplish in the classroom and with older children, as you talk about the larger impact in the community. So I think we need to be aware of the fact that this is a time where children, no matter how old they are aware of, even if all they do is see something on television, that there is a lot of strife in the community, and it's going to be extra important to focus on building that community within your classroom through community building circles, through play, through laughter, through humor, also through the choice of literature you read, through the writing opportunities you have. I think providing those opportunities to talk to one another and share with one another as your own classroom community is going to be really important in establishing these relationships within the schools and within your classrooms.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. Okay, so that's it for that part. And our intention in this is to really think about sort of building a foundation for social emotional learning supports. We tried to identify strategies that will really, again, build a strong foundation and work at a universal level. That's not to say that once you have these foundational practices in place, you can't find ways to really build them out and integrate across your foundational practices. But we wanted to really start off at this level and give you some examples of things that you could do. We have a planning guide that picks up on everything that we've talked about today and is aligned with the LDOE Strong Start guidance. And we hope that you'll think about that planning guide as a tool to really, again, begin to help you put some of these practices on the ground in your school. Within each of the 3 domains that we talked about, the planning guide includes some considerations that you should think about as you're thinking about adopting some of the things that we talked about today. So how have you gotten teacher voice in this? How have you checked in with your students? And really thinking about the context in which you're utilizing some of these things. So the planning considerations will help you answer some key questions as you're thinking about the work. And then the planning guide also has both material resources that will be useful for you in implementing the work, but also community resources. So potential community partners here in New Orleans that could help support your efforts in these areas and really be either a thought partner or a practice partner for you in this work. There is an action planning tool in the planning guide that can really help you identify the priorities, so where to start and really how to drill down on setting some goals in these areas. And then we've included an example schedule just to illustrate how these different supports can be integrated across a day, across a week in your school, so that it will give you a sense of again, how to begin building these things out. Kathleen, Liz, anything else you want to say about the planning guide? No, we're good. Okay, so we hope that it'll be a useful tool for you. If you have questions after watching this webinar, please feel free to email me. You might have a question for me. If you have a question for a member of our team, I'm happy to connect you to the right person and facilitate you getting some support and answers to those questions. We hope as a collaborative to produce some additional webinars to continue to provide support for you as you take on this work and carry it forward. And we really appreciate you tuning into the webinar. So thank you.